hi, everyone. It's nice to see you again in Amherst. Sorry, we're not in Amherst, but nice to see you again. As Perk mentioned, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jane Wald. I'm the executive director of the Emily Dickinson Museum. This is a kind of virtual tour. This experience of Dickinson and Shakespeare in Amherst was first conceived around the visit of a first folio to Amherst. And last year, when we thought we might be in Amherst for the meeting, we were ready to go with this as an on-site discussion through the homestead and the evergreens. But it's been a little bit different this year. The homestead and the evergreens have been closed, partly for COVID and partly for restoration that's going on, which I can say a little bit more about tomorrow at the business meeting. But in this case, we will be leading you in the next hour through some of Dickinson and Shakespeare's shared stories that played out in Amherst and over Emily Dickinson's lifetime. So I'd like to introduce members of the Emily Dickinson Museum staff who helped to put together this presentation. And I'm not sure all of us are here, but I see Becky. Becky Lockwood?
Hello, everyone. I'm Becky Lockwood. I've been a guide at the museum for 6 years, and I will be reading in this presentation. I'll be reading Emily's words from her poems and her letters.
And then Judith, are you here?
I am. Hello, everyone. I'm Judith Hudson. I've also been a guide at the museum for the last 6 years. And during the tour, I will be reading the words of Shakespeare in the plays that Emily Dickinson read.
And our narrator today is our dear friend Susan Snively, who is not on camera actually, but her words are here, and she will be reading the part of the narrator. So this is going to be a PowerPoint presentation, and I'll just go ahead and get it started.
The Poet and the Bard is a virtual program and tour for the 2021 annual meeting of the Emily Dickinson International Society. Slide. In Two Noble Kinsmen, Shakespeare writes, "This garden has a world of pleasures in it." So we begin our exploration of the poet and the bard here in Emily Dickinson's garden, where, like Shakespeare, she found a world of pleasure in nature's offerings and continual inspiration for her poetry and letters. She began gardening at age 12, and continued doing so for the rest of her life. "I was reared in the garden, you know," she wrote to her cousins, Fanny and Wilkins. Shakespeare's affinity with nature was always part of his life, even as a city dweller. And later he would create his own famous garden at New Place. Shakespeare set 30 scenes in a garden and included over 150 plants in his poems and plays. Dickinson mentions over 70 plants in her letters and poems. For both authors, flowers were symbols of emotion.
"There's rosemary. That's for remembrance,"
says Ophelia in Hamlet. To Shakespeare's audience, the folk knowledge of plants was second nature, as the Victorian language of flowers was to Dickinson's audience. Dickinson once sent a letter to a friend along with a Cape jasmine.
"I send you a flower from my garden. Though it die in reaching you, you will know it lived when it left my hand. Hamlet wavered for all of us."
Quoting the bard's great work, the poet implies that Hamlet's wavering, like the flowers, represented a common human struggle with mortality. Such a theme is critical to poets and bards everywhere, and for none more so than Dickinson and Shakespeare. She wrote,
Drama's vitalist expression is the common day that arise and set about us. Other tragedy perish in the recitation. This, the best enact when the audience is scattered and the box is shut. Hamlet to himself, or Hamlet, had not Shakespeare wrote, though the Romeo left no record of his Juliet. It were infinite enacted in the human heart. Only theater recorded owner cannot shut.
We'll use this time to explore the Dickinson family houses, the homestead and the Evergreens, where Shakespeare became an invisible but important guest. At a young age, Dickinson began a lifelong relationship with the works of William Shakespeare. His poems and plays are among the most important traceable influences on Dickinson's own writing. The poet encountered Shakespeare at a pivotal moment for theater and the American reading public, when perceptions of the bard changed from condemnation to acceptance and celebration within the theater and the literary canon. Through her close reading, Dickinson engaged Shakespeare in a conversation about poetry that crossed centuries, oceans, nationality, and gender. A conversation that helped her to value her own poetic impulses. She spent most of her life here at the homestead, built by her grandfather. In these family photos, Edward Dickinson, a prominent lawyer, Emily's mother, Emily Norcross Dickinson, her brother, Austin, and her sister, Lavinia. When her brother later married Susan Gilbert, they lived next door at the Evergreens. In these spaces, we'll consider Shakespeare's presence in Dickinson's culture, education, and reading, even in her private theatricals. We'll also pay attention to Shakespeare's effect on Dickinson's poems and letters. During the poet's lifetime, her culture became saturated with Shakespearean language. Shakespeare calendars gave a quote a day. A Shakespeare birthday book, owned by Dickinson's niece, Martha, provided quotations for the birthdays of both families. For her Aunt Emily on December 10th, the quotes were from Henry VI.
I hear, yet say not much, but think the more.
And from Macbeth,
Angels are bright still, though the brightest fell.
Dickinson's 1848 Webster's Lexicon used sentences from Shakespeare to illustrate the meaning and use of words. Later on, newspaper advertisements challenged readers with a parody of Hamlet, to buy or not to buy. The growing appearance of Shakespeare in American popular culture was at odds with the perceptions of the bard in the 18th and early 19th century. In fact, during Dickinson's school years, two presidents of Amherst College, in 1845, and Edward Hitchcock, 1845 to 54, criticized Shakespeare. Hitchcock called him a libertine in principle and practice. If Shakespeare's connections to the seedy, immoral world of the theater weren't enough to repel New Englanders, his association with England, the colonial power, made some people skeptical. Here's a wry little poem on that subject from Dickinson.
My country need not change her gown. Her triple suit as sweet as Lent was cut at Lexington and first pronounced to fit. Great Britain disproves the stars, disparagement discreet. There's something in their attitude that taunts her bayonet.
Even into the mid-19th century, some Americans believed that performances of Shakespeare carried an inherent British colonial message that they found threatening. Edwin Forrest, an American actor, and William Charles Grady, a well-known British actor, had engaged in a tense rivalry for several years. Grady was chosen to play Macbeth at New York's Astor Place Theater on May 10, 1849. Forrest's supporters formed an angry mob of approximately 15,000. The incident became known as the Astor Place riots and resulted in 15 deaths. Although Shakespeare's plays were performed in New England, we can find no evidence of their having been staged in Amherst during Dickinson's lifetime. Strong Puritan ethics still saw theater as a threat to family values. In the mid-19th century, public readings of the same works were far more acceptable because they belonged to the literary milieu. One popular reader was Fanny Kemble, who appeared in Springfield in 1849. Of the actress, Dickinson wrote to her cousin, public lectures were open.
My fault, I'm sorry.
Dickinson once wrote,
Father buys me many books, but begs me not to read them for fear they joggle the mind.
let's consider how the poet's early Shakespeare habit developed. Dickinson began reading Shakespeare around the age of 14, the year she recorded her first Shakespeare reference, a quote from Macbeth in a letter to her friend Abia.
Since I wrote you last, the summer is past and gone, and autumn with the sere and yellow leaf is already upon us.
Later, when she was 22, she found fresh meaning in this passage, writing to her friend Sue Gilbert.
Vinny and I have been talking about growing old today. Vinny thinks 20 must be a fearful position for one to occupy. Vinny expresses her sympathy at my sere and yellow leaf.
From that young age onward, it tickled Dickinson's fancy to cast her family and friends, and even herself, as Shakespeare's leading characters. In a poem intended for her brother Austen, she wrote,
Great Caesar, condescend thy daisy to receive, gathered by Cato's daughter with your majestic leave.
Cato's daughter, named Portia, may have signaled a private joke between Emily and Austen. In Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, Portia delivers her famous Quality of Mercy speech dressed in a lawyer's gown. Dickinson, the daughter and sister of lawyers, might have fantasized wearing such a gown. Here's Portia.
The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes.
Like Portia, Dickinson was an educated woman. At Mount Holyoke Seminary, where the poet spent a year in 1847, one fellow student carefully annotated her yearbook with quotes from Shakespeare, apropos for each classmate. This catalog exists today in the Dickinson Archive at Amherst College, handwritten next to the name Emily E. Dickinson. This classmate inscribed a passage from Othello.
She is ever fair and never proud, hath tongue at will and yet is never loud.
3 years after Mount Holyoke, following Richard Henry Dana's Amherst Shakespeare lectures, a group of young 20-somethings started a Shakespeare club here in town. The group included Emily Dickinson, her siblings, her future sister-in-law, and her friend Emily Fowler. When the men in the club thought Shakespeare's plays should be censored of improper language, Dickinson and her friends revolted. Emily Fowler wrote, "The plan was negatived at the first meeting as far as the girls spoke, who said they did not want the strange things emphasized, nor their books spoiled with marks. Finally, we told the men to do as they liked. We shall read everything." I remember the lofty air with which Emily took her departure, saying,
"There's nothing wicked in Shakespeare, and if there is, I don't want to know it."
The men read for perhaps 3 meetings from their expurgated editions, and then gave up their plan, and the whole text was read out boldly. This boldness, perhaps, it is a tour de force of delicious, seductive wackiness. The accompanying letter ends with a quote from Macbeth's witches, "All hail." The irreverence, boldness, and touches of wildness in the Valentine show how Shakespeare had already inspired her to cross boundaries. Coincidentally, the same edition of The Indicator contains an essay on Shakespeare's women, which praises his female characters as models of femininity, purity, and dignity. The unnamed writer says he is grateful there are no female Hamlets who spend time thinking about their own existence. Dickinson scholar Parrot Finnerty has written that the poet was herself a female Hamlet, said by Vinnie to be the family member who had the thinking to do. From the time the poet was 9 until she was 25, she and her family lived in a different house on Pleasant Street in Amherst. It was located adjacent to the West Cemetery, where the poet, her sister, and her parents are buried. She witnessed funerals and burials, events that inspired her frequent contemplation of death and suffering. The Civil War took the lives of 60 Amherst men, including young Fraser Stearns, son of the college president, killed in battle in March 1862. Writing most of her poems during the years of the Civil War, Dickinson would have read local tragedies through Shakespeare's lens. To her cousins, she wrote,
"I read a few words since I came home. John Talbot's parting with his son, and Margaret's with Suffolk. I read them in the garret, and the rafters swept."
Both references are to Henry VI. Such scenes of separation depict the suffering of people parted by violence. Shakespeare's John Talbot says of his dead son,
Where is my other life? Mine own is gone. Oh, where is young Talbot? Where is valiant John? Into the clustering battle of the French, and in that sea of blood, my boy did drench his overmounting spirit. And there died my Icarus, my blossom in his pride.
Edward Dickinson purchased for the family the popular 8-volume illustrated Shakespeare, published in 1853 and edited by Charles Knight. 2 volumes show much evidence of use. The pages depicting Antony's death in Antony and Cleopatra enclose a piece of pink string, and a scrap of brown material marks Cleopatra's preparations for her death. Dickinson read Shakespeare with passion. In 1866, after treating the poet for recurring eye troubles, Dickinson's doctor allowed her once more to read, and she rejoiced at her reunion with her favorite writer. In a letter to her friend Joseph Lyman, she wrote,
Well, do I remember the music of the welcome home. I flew to the shelves and devoured the luscious passages. Shakespeare was the first, Antony and Cleopatra. Then I settled down to a willingness for all the rest to go but William Shakespeare. Why need we Joseph read anything else but him?
Upstairs, there's more evidence of Shakespeare's influence on the poet and her craft. As our tour goes on, you will see a bolder Emily Dickinson. Her attachment to Shakespeare hints at her own passions, both disclosed and kept secret. In many of Dickinson's 1789 poems, she carries on an intellectual dialogue with Shakespeare's characters. Sometimes she seems to compress the contents of an entire Shakespeare play into a single poem, using a
spit
key
on
word
it,
as
caught
the
that front door step, the only meat bar in San Francisco, being asked to show proof of vaccination. Great.
the air. She compresses the Tempest into 12 lines from Caliban's perspective. The magician Prospero's slave, Caliban, suffers from resentment and jealousy in his debased position. The first 8 lines of the poem describe the storm and then offer a shift in perspective as Caliban anticipates the end of his torment.
An awful tempest mashed the air. The clouds were gaunt and few. A black as of a specter's cloak hid heaven and earth from view. The creatures chuckled on the roofs and whistled in the air and shook their fists and gnashed their teeth and swung their frenzied hair. The morning lit, the birds arose. The monster's faded eyes turned slowly to its native coast, and peace was paradise.
In Hamlet's famous soliloquy, to be or not to be, that is the question. Hamlet agonizes about his mortality, the sea of troubles he endures, and the dread of something after death he cannot know. Dickinson poses a different question.
What if I say I shall not wait? What if I burst the fleshly gate and pass escaped to thee? What if I file this mortal off? See where it hurt me? That's enough, and wade in liberty.
Perhaps the shocking deaths of young men such as Fraser Stearns mingled with her own yearning for spiritual freedom, and she became another kind of Hamlet, dressed in a simple white dress, not Hamlet's customary suit of solemn black. In their experiments with language, both the poet and the bard mixed intellectual and commonplace vocabularies. In this excerpt from Hamlet, Shakespeare uses words from the court and the tavern, high and low language. Hamlet says,
To what base uses we may return, Horatio? Why may not imagination trace the noble dust of Alexander till it find it stopping a bunghole?
in a Dickinsonian example of high mixed with low language, she uses creatures from her own garden to raise a question about sexual propriety and language packed with suggestive images.
Did the harebell lose her girdle to the lover bee? Would the bee the harebell hallow much as formerly? Did the paradise, persuaded, yield her mote of pearl? Would the Eden be an Eden, or the Earl an Earl?
The poet and the bard also shared a facility for blending tragedy and humor and reducing huge universal ideas to a very palpable hit. Shakespeare wrote,
As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport.
Said the blind, embittered Gloucester in King Lear. For Dickinson, flies were both domestic annoyances, as in a poem where
Flies gallop on the furniture.
and evidence of mortality, as in
I heard a fly buzz when I died.
Dickinson's appropriation of Shakespeare's characters to use in her letters was not only playful, but also held encoded meanings. Austen was Oliver from As You Like It, the tongue-in-cheek reference connecting his secret engagement to Sue Gilbert with the fictional character Oliver's attraction to Sue. In a note to her sister-in-law Susan, Dickinson used a single line from Antony and Cleopatra, "Egypt, thou knewest." These words encode Sue's full supremacy over her. Place became a telegraphic code for name. Antony called Cleopatra his Egypt. Dickinson referred to her late love, Judge Otis Phillips Lord, as her lovely sailor, and to herself as his amorist. On her bedroom wall was Lord's portrait. For Christmas 1880, Lord gave Dickinson a handsome concordance to Shakespeare. A devoted reader of the Bard, Judge Lord would have recognized the Shakespearean references in the poet's often mischievous letters to him. In Shakespeare's characters, Dickinson found a looking glass for herself. She played various roles, wore different costumes, and sometimes broke out of her gender when she described herself as a boy or wore tough armor, as she does in these lines from a poem.
If your nerve deny you, go above your nerve.
These lines carry a shivery echo of Lady Macbeth's admonishment to her husband.
Screw your courage to the sticking place and will not fail.
Like Shakespeare, Dickinson was fascinated by the idea of shape-shifting in the weather, words, and human beings, as in this vivid poem that begins,
The tint I cannot take is best, the fine, impalpable array that swaggers on the eye like Cleopatra's company, repeated in the sky.
The wide windows of her bedroom opened onto an array of dramas in earth and sky, a worldview she shared with her great Elizabethan predecessor. On Shakespeare's pages,
Sometimes we see a cloud that's dragonish.
in Dickinson's,
A curious cloud surprised the sky. 'Twas like a sheep with horns.
much of the poet's Shakespearean shape-shifting, try saying that quickly, was inspired or enabled by her close relationships with her family. At the Evergreens, where Austen and Sue Dickinson lived after they married in 1856, the poet visited frequently before she withdrew from the labyrinth social events. Sue had been a friend and confidant of Dickinson's from a young age. She presided over one of the most fashionable homes in town, entertaining guests of artistic and political importance, upholding the prestigious Dickinson name in Amherst, and raising 3 children. But despite the fact that the women took different paths, they remained intellectual companions. In the last years of her life, the poet wrote to Sue,
With the exception of Shakespeare, you have told me of more knowledge than anyone living. To say that sincerely is strange praise.
Austen's position as treasurer of Amherst College meant that the family, both here and at the homestead, remained connected to the life on campus. By 1868, approval of Shakespeare in the academic world was evident, The college established an official Shakespeare club. Shakespeare had finally arrived on stage at the college in the form of travesties popular in 19th century theater. These collegiate hijinks took some of the Bard's most popular and tragic plays and turned them into Greek comedy with a heavy dose of sing-songy lyricism. One year, the Glee Club presented a travesty of Hamlet, which featured To Be or Not to Be, sung to the tune of Three Blind Mice. Some of them acknowledged the debate about Shakespeare's authorship, a subject that still roils theatrical and academic circles. The prologue to the travesty of Romeo and Juliet, performed at Amherst in 1881, offers especially lucid insight into these burlesques.
In ancient days there lived a bard, a man of note, who dramas wrote. From all the centuries 'twere hard, and all the lands, to rake his peer.
Oh, oh, Bill Shakespeare, oh, oh.
He made such perfect poetry that critics wink and say they think Lord Bacon wrote anonymously the works of William Shakespeare.
Oh, oh, Bill Shakespeare, oh, oh.
Although his plays are very bright for one who wrote so long ago, viewed in our 19th century light, his dramas no great Shakespeare.
Oh, oh, Bill Shakespeare, oh, oh.
In these fast telegraphic times, some mastermind we ought to find, someone expert in matching rhymes to modernize old Shakespeare.
Oh, oh, Bill Shakespeare, oh, oh.
On a more exalted occasion in 1879, Ralph Waldo Emerson, a guest in the Evergreens on his visits, spoke at Amherst College. In the audience, a senior named Henry Folger was inspired to read Emerson's 1864 tribute to the Bard, written on the 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth. On that occasion, Emerson had said, "Shakespeare taught us that the little world of the heart is vaster, deeper, and richer than the spaces of astronomy." Words that remind us of a poem by Emily Dickinson.
The infinite, a sudden guest, has been assumed to be, but how can that stupendous come which never went away?
Henry Folger later became president of Standard Oil, and with his wife Emily, spent their lives collecting Shakespeareana. Eventually, the Folger Library was founded as a gift to the American people and opened in 1932. By then, Shakespeare had attained full pop culture status in the United States and, of course, in Britain, where tourists flocked to pay homage at his tomb. Dickinson may have known this rubbing from Shakespeare's grave, a rubbing which was found in the collection at the Evergreens. Its ominous inscription warns,
Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man who spares these stones, and cursed be the man who moves my bones.
Items like these now fill collections of the Folger Library, which also contains 82 of the 233 known first folios. The Emily Dickinson Museum collections encompass the 2 Dickinson family homes, the 3 remaining acres of the family's domestic landscape, and more than 10,000 Dickinson family objects in its collection. In Shakespeare's As You Like It, the cynical and world-weary character Jaques famously says,
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages.
Let us now turn to Dickinson's final age. Later in her life, the poet's rigorous exchange of letters with friends shows her continued musings on complex trouble characters like Lady Macbeth, Othello, and Hamlet. Their struggle with mortality became infinite enacted in her own heart, as she wrote in drama's vitalist expression, "It's the common day." Dickinson wrote a letter to her troubled cousin, Perez Cowan, using words from Macbeth. Do you remember what the physician said to Macbeth? That sort must heal itself. Dickinson's variation on Shakespeare's words emphasized the pain of a guilty conscience and the loneliness of a soul adrift. Writing to a friend and neighbor who had moved away from Amherst, Dickinson used Othello to express jealousy of possessive friendships.
It is homeless without you when we think of others possessing you with the throes of Othello.
The final years of the poet's life were marked by losses. Her mother, her 8-year-old nephew, Gibb Dickinson, who died of typhoid, and her beloved friend, Otis Phillips Lord. She wrote,
The dyings have been too deep for me.
even in the month prior to the poet's death, the bard still inhabited her thoughts. Quoting from Romeo and Juliet and making reference to the local drugstore up the street, an unwell Dickinson wrote to her ailing Aunt Elizabeth Currier.
I do remember an apothecary, a loved paragraph which has lain on my pillow all winter, but perhaps Shakespeare has been up street oftener than I have this winter.
Dickinson had less than a month to live, but the letter struck a grave note.
I haven't felt quite as well as usual since the chestnuts were ripe, but the crocuses are so martial and the daffodils to the second join. Let us join hands and recover.
Whether she knew how near she was to death, she seemed to have imagined death as the portal to reunion with those she had lost, voices that still called her back. Approaching her own death, Dickinson cited Hamlet in one of her final messages to Sue.
Do you remember what whispered to Horatio?
Hamlet's dying words to his loyal friend and confidant, Horatio, were,
Report me and my cause aright to the unsatisfied. If thou didst ever hold me in thy heart, absent thee from felicity a while, and in this harsh world draw thy breath in pain to tell my story.
in an unsigned obituary published in the 1886 Springfield Republican, 3 days after the poet's death, Susan Dickinson wrote, keen and eclectic in her literary tastes, she sifted libraries to Shakespeare and Browning. Quick as the electric spark in her intuitions and analyses, she seized the kernel instantly, almost impatient of the fewest words by which she must make her revelation. As Shakespeare himself did, Emily Dickinson leapt from the pages of her poems into the wider world. Her poetry, published after her death, reached acclaim by the turn of the brand new 20th century, with the help of her sister and earliest editors, Mabel Loomis Todd and Thomas Wentworth Higginson. As Todd prepared for a visit to Europe in the summer before Dickinson died, the poet, in characteristic linguistic economy, petitioned Todd to
touch Shakespeare for me.
And so we conclude our virtual tour celebrating the poet and the bard, both of whom continue to be vital voices in our contemporary world.
Well, thank you for joining us. I hope that the next time we are able to offer a tour, it'll be to you in person. So we haven't prepared any sort of Q&A, but if you'd like to make comments, that would be wonderful, or you can give yourself a break. I know that's coming up anyway.
I'll just say, Jane, that was wonderful, and thank you so much to the museum and to the readers. That it was beautifully done, and thank you. I think it's a kind of helps to summarize the different ways in which Dickinson engages with Shakespeare. So that was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I want to especially thank Becky Lockwood, Judith Hudson, and Susan Snively, who worked so hard to put this together.
They did a wonderful job. Thank you to them and to you too, Jane. It was very moving.
I want to give special credit to Perrick because it was his book on Dickinson and Shakespeare that informed the original, a lot of the work in the original tour. So thanks, Perrick.
Thank you, Becky. And to be quite honest with you, one of the highlights of my life so far is actually attending the live tour on Dickinson and Shakespeare in the museum that you all did so wonderfully back in May 2016. It's one of the highlights of my life. So thank you.
I'd also like to give recognition to Melva Jensen and Brooke Steinhauser, who worked with our small group on producing this script.
Yes.
Jane, by the way, I want to thank everybody, including as Susan was saying, all the people who were involved in presenting this, because this seems like a wonderful way that the museum is really tantalizing all of our members to come back to Amherst. And we hope that happens sometime soon after maybe the 2022 Seville Conference. And now that we have, a YouTube channel, it'd be wonderful to link these sorts of productions with what we have there, so people can continue to be updated and to keep current with what's happening at the museum. So thank you.
That's right. Yes, the next time the Emily Dickinson International Society is in Amherst, you will see a fabulously restored homestead. And more to come on that. So thank you all.
Thank y'all.
We can unmute now, yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Will we have a break now and until 4:30 your time and 9:30 my time and 10:30 Adeline's time? So have a break. Have a coffee or whatever. Okay, thank you very much again, Jane, and to the guides and Becky, and thank you.
Thank you, and Judith. Thank you.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Direction. Yeah, I know. Let's see.
For anyone who's still around, I know this is a dumb question, but the reference in there in that wonderful hour to the controversy of did Shakespeare write Shakespeare did come up. Those of you who've worked on that, how much did that come up in? Because I think the date of the controversy that was cited was after her death, but how much in her lifetime, for those of you who work on Shakespeare, was in the air, and how much do you think she paid attention to it?
I could give you a little bit of an answer. Here, let me show myself again. Here I am.
It's a wonderful Elizabeth. Okay, yes.
It was in the air. I mean, there was Delia Bacon, who was a really interesting very intellectual woman, but who became utterly obsessed with proving that Shakespeare was written by Francis Bacon. And she actually met with Emerson, and some other notable people of the day, and got their backing, even got like a letter of recommendation to go to London where she was working on it. And this was maybe the 50s, I would say, 1850s. I think Park also got very interested in learning about this Delia Bacon, but there was the high criticism, the criticism that had started to look at the Bible as being written by many authors. It was questioning assumptions people had about its construction, influenced the idea that maybe what we're assuming about Shakespeare isn't true either. But it wasn't the majority of people. And Dickinson, as far as I can tell, never bought into it, and had little patience with it, and thought it was quite exasperating. Mark Twain became actually somebody who thought Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. But there's a really great book called by James Shapiro. I'll put this in the chat, and it's called it's Contested Will. That's it. Contested Will. And then the subtitle is Who Wrote Shakespeare, which I bet he didn't want that title. I bet that was the publisher to make it more sellable, because the book is really all about how there is absolutely no evidence for any of these crazy theories, and actually relatively a lot of evidence for the man from Stratford.
Thank you. Reassuring.
I could just add to that. So in August 1881, Dickinson was unsatisfied by William Deal Howell's A Fearful Responsibility, and she wrote, "Who wrote Mr. Howell's story?" She continues, "Certainly he did not. Shakespeare was never accused of writing Bacon's works, though to have been suspected of writing his was the most beautiful stigma of Bacon's life. Higher is the doom of the high." And it's chapter 721.
Oh, it's wonderful. Thank you. I know a few of those people here. They do believe. There's a whole big group that meets regularly here in Washington.
Oh, in Washington. Oh, and they meet regularly. It's another, it goes with other kinds of conspiracy theories. It's like, it kind of, yeah.
You have to wonder if they're anti-vaxxers.
Right. Because I mean, because you have to ignore evidence, the scientific, social science method, and yeah.
Sorry, am I rushing people through this? I feel like I'm rushing people. I don't mean to rush people. It's just that I'm just conscious of us keeping. Sorry, am I rushing people?
You're doing a wonderful job, if I might say, and for
you're fine.
For everyone. I was going to respond. We do need to just make it through, and I think we're having wonderful conversations. So it's really not a problem to go a little bit later. But I was writing in the chat that it's 12 hours later currently in Taiwan, and that's why the recordings are going to be so important, I think, to be able to be accessible to everyone. So no, thank you, Parek, for keeping us on track.
Just two little footnotes on that, on two of those slides. The one about the disputed authorship of Shakespeare, that was performed at Amherst College in 1881, and I believe that Ned Dickinson was in that class, though he didn't graduate from that class. So, but I think he did participate in many of the class activities. So maybe Emily Dickinson's son was singing "Oh, oh, Bill Shakespeare." Oh, oh. And then The other thing was that grave rubbing was just, I mean, the first time I saw that at the Evergreens in the collection, I was just dumbfounded. It was really surprising. And, we'd like to, I mean, in an ideal story world, it would refer directly to, have a direct connection to Emily's request to Mabel Todd to touch Shakespeare. But it's more likely it was a souvenir from the first half of the 20th century. But tantalizing.
I would just like to say when we started writing the script, we didn't focus on the garden, and what was a wonderful revelation for us doing it together was to see how important landscape was to both Shakespeare and Dickinson, and to realize that Shakespeare spent so many, wrote so many scenes in gardens was something that we hadn't appreciated.
Gorgeous pictures.
I think I'd like to add too, one of the other things that we discovered as we were researching and writing the original tour was the change in the culture in how folks viewed Shakespeare, but in this country. The Revolutionary War had ended only 53 years when Emily Dickinson was born. So this country was still establishing, as we mentioned in the tour, it was still establishing its own national identity for literature and for theater. Noah Webster was trying to create a language that was not as British, but was truly American. And it was really fun to watch over the years how the views of Shakespeare changed. And then all the other literary things that happened as well.